So there was this really interesting kind of extension of Colombo Plan students as cultural ambassadors in ways that opened a lot of Australian eyes.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. So 75 years ago this month, in January 1950, Australia joined 6 other Commonwealth countries in the Sri Lankan capital, Colombo, to agree to a plan to build the economic and social development of South and Southeast Asia. It was here that the Colombo Plan was born. This product of the Cold War, with all its anti-communist concerns, led to the education of thousands of international students right here in Australia. Joining me for this special Afternoon Light Live to discuss the Colombo Plan is Professor David Lowe, Chair in Contemporary History at Deakin University. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much, Julian.
It's great to have you here. So, David, before we get on to the Colombo Plan, I thought it might be worth painting a picture of what Australia was like and what Australia was doing in January 1950. And of course, here at the Robert Menzies Institute, we focus a lot on the political history. And so the big thing that had just happened in the December of 1949 was the election, which had led to a change in government, and the election of the first ever Liberal government, and of course led by one Robert Gordon Menzies. But what else was happening in Australia and I guess the sort of broader world in that January 1950?
It's a really good question. I mean, 1950, of course, is that pivot point of the 20th century, and there was a bit of navel-gazing going on. You know, what would the second half of the 20th century look like? I guess the other big external event, which was preoccupying a lot of people, was the declaration of victory by Mao in Communist China very recently in the lead up to 1950. So the implications of a communist China and what Australia would do, including whether to diplomatically recognise or not, was a really big issue, which coincided with the arrival of the Menzies government. But otherwise, you know, it was very much a case of that transition from post-war planning and still a fair bit of austerity towards, you know, what people hoped would be steady growth and resumption of Australia's kind of development. So development issues, I mean, the Colombo Plan that we're about to talk about, of course, is all about development. But when you look at some of the priorities of the incoming Menzies government, you can see similarities in terms of housing, migration, just how to develop this country as effectively as we could.
Yeah, I mean, economic development was, of course, a massive priority for the Menzies government and its predecessor government.
Absolutely.
And I guess that's something to reflect on as we talk today. There was a bit of continuity with the Chifley government. Of course, there were wide differences in approach, and Menzies was elected on a sort of anti-bank nationalisation agenda and anti-socialist agenda with his new Liberal Party. But a lot of the policies we're going to talk about today did have some continuity.
I think that's right, Georgina. I think there'd been a fair bit of work done in this new External Affairs Department, which suggested that it was time for Australians to think really seriously about how to provide assistance to newly decolonising parts of Asia. Indonesia was really the big case study that they focused on, and a lot of work went into thinking hard about what Australians could usefully offer, be it fertiliser, fencing, agricultural assistance, forms of power generation. You know, the whole list was kind of laid out. Now, embarrassingly almost, at the end of one of these processes of drawing up a big list with Indonesia in mind, the conclusion was, by many officials, was actually we need all that stuff too, which goes to the very point about development being a common theme.
It's interesting too, at that time, Australia didn't see itself as a sort of, I guess, fully developed country, did it? It had this kind of hybrid where it was partly developed but partly a developing country. So that concern, for example, about Indonesia feeds into that, doesn't it? That, okay, Indonesia might need all these things, and of course we have an interest in providing Indonesia with all those things because we don't want them to, you know, fall into the hands of global communism. But we need to, you know, develop our economy, develop our, you know, agricultural industries, build human capital through education, our energy system needs to develop, all those things.
Very much. In fact, I think one of the interesting things about Australia's involvement in the Colombo Plan was the kind of language that needed to be learned. You find, for, say, the first half of the 1950s, when Australians are talking to governments in Asia, there's still a tendency to speak, especially by Casey, External Affairs Minister Casey, with a sort of enlightened colonial kind of touch. You know, we are a successful experiment. courtesy of our British heritage and so on. But they realised by about the middle of the decade, 1955-ish, that this discourse wasn't really going down too well. And so you find a very deliberate shift, including led by Casey, to give him his due, deliberate shift towards saying, we actually share problems in common with you. We have our own development challenges. And I think that's one of the interesting kind of things that the Colombo Plan helped the Australians to learn in terms of how to speak sensibly to Asian leaders.
Yeah. The other thing I thought we'd touch upon before we get into this January meeting that really sets up the Colombo Plan is the Commonwealth itself. So we have a newly independent India and a newly independent Pakistan. These are part of the Commonwealth, but of course had been colonies of the British Empire. And so the nature of the relationship with these countries is very newly changed. I mean, what was that dynamic like?
That really underscores the kind of questions hanging in the air at this Colombo meeting in January 1950. There'd been a series of Commonwealth heads of government meetings, mostly in London in the late 1940s, including to discuss matters like India, the future of India. But also they decided in the wake of World War II that it was time to have meetings of not just leaders, prime ministers, but senior cabinet ministers. So there'd been a meeting of finance ministers in 1949, and the Colombo meeting was the first one of external affairs ministers, foreign affairs ministers. So it was meant to also foreshadow a kind of extension of Commonwealth cooperation at ministerial level. Now, it really was the first and only one. Actually, there weren't subsequent ones, but nevertheless, it was part of this idea of how the Commonwealth could grow and it could devolve agency to countries so that places like Australia and New Zealand might take greater leadership roles in their neck of the woods and so on. So it's a really interesting time for the Commonwealth, as you suggest.
So tell me about this 9th of January meeting of these Commonwealth foreign ministers, the first time and sounds like the only time they met in this format. I'm sure they met many other times in different formats. But tell me what happened and the lead up to it.
Yeah, so the meeting itself lasted, I think there were about 6 days in all of official meetings, but there were officials had gathered before that to lay some groundwork for the ministerial 6 days. And it was in the old Senate House, this glorious old building in the middle of Colombo. There was a lot of press interest, a lot of drama around it. Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, had to travel by ship because of a heart problem he had. They didn't want him flying. And he had to be carried up 2 flights of stairs very publicly in order. So there's all this press
pretty
attention.
Dramatic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And probably not great optics for the great, former British Empire to be represented by an incapacitated foreign minister.
But a lot of attention, especially by the Ceylonese press, as Ceylon was called still at that point, and a lot of anticipation. I mean, we've got to remind ourselves, Georgina, that the Marshall Plan for this massive aid program to help post-war Europe was not that old. It was still only getting underway, and other UN-based agencies were starting to strut their stuff in terms of how to help people. And so we'd emerged from World War II into this era of international grandiose plans by which you could help recovery, provide basics of things like food, and, as you pointed out before, counter communism wherever possible. So expectations, in short, were pretty high. Would Colombo yield something akin to the Marshall Plan? So
when we hear of the Colombo Plan, should we think that at least the level of ambition at the time was somewhat like the Marshall Plan? Because you don't probably hear about them in similar terms these days, but in terms of the intentions at the moment of decision. Yeah, look, there were some parties who would have loved it to take similar shape, including delegates from India in the lead up to it, or if not the Colombo Plan, a new agency of the United Nations called ECAFE is the acronym, the Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East. That was bubbling around at the same time as well. So some people harboured ambitions in that direction. They didn't get very far because the Americans and British nipped it in the bud. But the financial kind of circumstances weren't right. We need to remind ourselves that Britain owed massive debts to India, Pakistan, and to a lesser extent Ceylon. And they wanted to use this meeting in Colombo as a means by which they would regulate their repayments of debts and not have sterling pulled down by the Indians who'd been doing it at a rate much greater than the British wanted, thereby destabilising the value of the pound,
possibly causing a run on the pound. So the British hoped to arrive and come up with an aid program that was ostensibly regulating their repayments of debts, which they already owed anyway.
And the debts were owed to these countries
Mostly
for their contributions during World War II?
Absolutely.
Yeah. But so actually the British, you could argue, were trying to get away with paying off the debts but calling it aid.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was their main plan. And they hoped that the Americans would fill gaps. They knew that they wouldn't be able to cope with all the kind of needs identified, but they hoped that if they came up with a good program, they could regulate payments of sterling balances and hopefully entice the Americans to come in and fill these massive gaps they knew would emerge. And maybe, again, there's a bit of an echo of Marshall Plan in that hope. Now, it didn't work out, but the British hopes were so high that they sort of walked away from Colombo pretty disappointed. And I argue that this has queered the pitch for the historiography too. A lot of British historians dive into this lead up to the Colombo conference and then they say, it just didn't matter and it's just reverted to telling the story of the Cold War. But from a British point of view, yeah, that's sort of right. All their hopes didn't work out. But from a lot of other countries, a lot of really interesting things happened and continue to happen.
Yeah. And of course, from Australia's perspective, it was a very, very important moment. So before we get into how it ended up actually not really being a Commonwealth project and with the entry of the US and then, of course, Japan, I wanted to talk about Percy Spender, who was Australia's External Affairs Minister at the time. He's only External Affairs Minister, I think, for under 18 months. But he does a lot of very important things while he is External Affairs Minister. And then, of course, ends up as our ambassador to the United States, signing the ANZUS on behalf of Australia. But, I mean, he's a Cold War realist. He's very concerned about the influence of the Soviet Union. He helps the Liberal Party as a Liberal Party office bearer as well as a Member of Parliament try and ban the Communist Party of Australia. Such were his concerns about the invidious nature of communism domestically as well as internationally. But, I mean, he has quite a essential role to play at this meeting and in the lead up to this meeting, doesn't he?
He does, and you're right to depict him as a realist. He was concerned with power politics, and the extension of power by the communist forces of the world was something that really troubled him. But different from some, and certainly different from the perspective of the likes of Ernest Bevin and other Europeans, he argued that the region around Australia had the dynamics of its own. So it wasn't just going to be a case of Moscow calling all the shots. He was very concerned at the extension of communism and, in addition to communism, radical nationalism, which who knows where it would go. I don't think because there were still countries championing at the bit for independence. So Spender, courtesy of a lot of cruises that he made as a successful barrister in the 1920s and 30s.
This is pleasure cruises.
Yeah, pleasure cruises. Okay. He got to know the region quite well at the same time that he was also becoming more attracted to the United States, as you mentioned, as an alternative source of world power after World War II, knowing how Britain would be emerging exhausted. So Spender maybe came up with an equation a little bit like the British in hoping that Americans would somehow fill the gap. But very unlike the British, argued that this region, this Asian region, was worthy of its own discrete thinking. It didn't have to be analysed purely from the optics of what was happening in Moscow. So he was very sensitive to dynamics and the danger of, I guess, foreshadowing what we later called the domino theory of, collapsing governments and the extension of communist power. So he hoped that from Colombo there would emerge something like an aid package, but maybe even it would lead to a greater sense of security architecture too. And you mentioned ANZUS and his involvement. So that was very much in the back of his mind when he went to Colombo.
Yeah. I mean, the formulation of the Colombo Plan, initially it was known as the Spender Plan, wasn't it? I mean, was that him pushing the moniker?
Yeah, very, very, very briefly. I mean, you can imagine how many treasuries around the world had sleepless nights at the prospect of a Spender Plan. So it was never going to get up.
But he claims that he came up with the Colombo Plan en route to the meeting, and then he's sort of not directly getting to Colombo. He stops via Indonesia and meets with Sukarno and tests out the idea of the Spender/Colombo Plan, what would become the Colombo Plan, with Sukarno. So he certainly has I think, some sort of parental claim to this Colombo Plan, doesn't he?
Oh, look, to some extent. I mean, a number of historians have sort of argued and tried to come up with the different delineation of ideas that congealed at at Colombo. Spender certainly has some claims to being one of the movers and shakers. And some of those ideas that he tested out in Indonesia were on show. He had very good support from external affairs officials such as Arthur Tang and others. But also the Sri Lankans had their own plans evolving in a similar manner, and they sort of got together at Colombo and combined their ideas. Spender, I think, is probably even more decisive in making things happen in the middle of the year, because there's another meeting in Sydney in May following up the Colombo meeting, and that's where he virtually jumps on the table and rants and says the British have got to stop this kind of hedging of their bets and waiting to get their sterling balances all lined up. Partly through, I think, his own political ambitions. You know, he had one eye on a possible tilt at prime ministership. He was very much a minister on the make, with good reason. He had a lot of ability, but he really pushed the others at that May meeting in Sydney to come up with a package that could be sold to the press, sold to the world, as an aid package that would make a difference. So in some ways, I'd argue his influence was even greater in the May meeting than it was at that Colombo.
Before we get on to what the plan actually comprised of, it'd be interesting to hear about why the plan was in Australia's interests in terms of how it conceptualised the reasons behind foreign aid. Because, I mean, you've written in this book, we've got it here, Lessons from History in your chapter in it, about, you know, the motivations of governments to contribute their country's money, basically the tax receipts from citizens and businesses in the country to overseas countries. I mean, there's obviously a lovely, we're doing good in the region and we're sharing our wealth, and we should do that as good neighbours. But I mean, Spender was a realist. The realist school is a strong school in Australian foreign policy. There were strategic concerns. There were concerns around power and influence that I presume were overriding concerns over and above the, good neighbour sentiment.
Yes. So Spender was calculating in that sense. And I think give credit to his department, to External Affairs. We've noted there was a bit of continuity from Labor to the new Liberal Country Party government. External Affairs had been for some time just puzzling over this new world. There was a withdrawal of European influence to Australia's north, the Dutch being kicked out of Indonesia, the British battling to maintain control in Malaya, the French struggling in Indochina, and so on. So this was a problem that External Affairs were grappling with, and Spender was one who was also very minded of these kind of things. So when you match that with an overlay of concern about communism, it made sense to come up with something of a response, even for a realist. And so Spender actually remarkably, was given by Menzies a pretty decent chunk of money to play with in the lead up to the Colombo conference and its aftermath too. Rarely do foreign ministers get a bit of license to have a decent chunk of money for an initiative. So he argued quite persuasively that it was in Australia's interests to take initiatives that would manage the process of decolonisation. Probably he hoped, as did Menzies, it would draw some of the teeth of the worst kind of feelings directed at Australia from its racial restrictive immigration policy. The White Australia policy was still very much, what was talked about in Asia. And he hoped he might lay the basis through Australia's preparedness, being prepared to do something. You were much more likely to involve the Americans. That they would come and help if they could see others helping themselves was very much part of Spender's logic.
Yeah, and I mean, this all plays into how we get ANZUS over the line, of course. And I mean, when you think about how much Australia spent on the Colombo Plan, it was $160 million up till 1968. I'm sure it will be on that after, but that was, in those terms, an extremely large amount of money Australia was spending.
It was very decent. That's right. When you look at some of the struggles foreign affairs ministers have had, it was, for its time, pretty remarkable. If you compared it to the New Zealanders were really reluctant to spend anything for about a year after the Colombo meeting. They really had to be dragged into thinking this way. The Canadians started off thinking, well, we're members of the Commonwealth, maybe we'll just give some money to India and Pakistan. They had to be dragged into thinking about the region a bit more broadly.
Yeah.
So in that context, Australia's progressive thinking stands out as pretty unusual and pretty remarkable.
So the Colombo Plan these days is very much known for the opportunities for South and Southeast Asian students to come to countries like Australia to study, but it was bigger than that. What was the contents?
In terms of financial heft, the biggest sums were always spent on capital assistance, big development projects. The Indians needed a lot of expenditure in things like hydroelectric, multi-pronged schemes that would deliver water, irrigation, new farming techniques accompanying that, and so on. Pakistan was similar. There were often farming needs or power generation needs was a big theme in South Asia. So it varied a little bit throughout the region. You find similar kind of power needs popping up in places like Burma and Thailand. So they were always the biggest ticket items in terms of spending. So you had these two arms to the Colombo Plan. One was capital in the kind of directions that I was talking about, and the other one was called technical assistance. The two main forms of technical assistance were sponsorship of students to come and get either higher education or technical training. Both worked in Australia's case. Or sending experts back so you could demonstrate specialist techniques in farming or medicine or whatever. So these two arms ran at the same time. They were the two particular arms of the Colombo Plan. As I mentioned, the capital stuff was always by far the bigger ticket item, but the technical assistance side was probably the better known for many people. And that, of course, captures the movement of students coming to Australia.
Yeah, and of course for Australians, that was the direct experience of the Colombo Plan, that you had these international students coming to universities or technical schools and, studying side by side, going to the shops, going to sort of community festivals and events. And this was a time when Australia was extremely white. 80 or so % of the population was Australian born and of British, Irish heritage. So they would have been quite unusual in the community and they would have stood out quite starkly.
Yeah, they did. And look, we've conducted some interviews. Colleagues and I have conducted interviews with some of those early Colombo Plan scholars, and most of them emerged with very positive stories, not without incident and not without instances of racism or ignorance at times. But I think you're right to pinpoint how just radically different this was for many Australians. So the term that I've started to use a little bit in some of the work I've done is that it encouraged a form of what I call vernacular internationalism. It worked its way down through the shops, through the students wandering outside the dorms of universities at times. Don't forget that if you were, say, a student from Malaya in 1952, when the end of term came, it was vastly too expensive to go home for Christmas or whatever. You stayed. And in that summer period, you were likely to be picked up by Rotary Club or a Christian club or Apex and given a tour of Australia's countryside. And so you had all this kind of ventures out into the country, watching sheep shearing, or in return for which you had to sing for your supper, you had to give a talk at the local thing. So there was this really interesting kind of extension of Colombo Plan students as cultural ambassadors in ways that opened a lot of Australian eyes.
I have so many more questions, and I can see we've already got a bucket load of questions coming in from the audience, which is great. So you and I have got 5 minutes just to finish off our discussion. I guess I would be interested in how much you think the Australian government used the international students who were coming to Australia, and some were coming via Colombo Plan, but I mean, you've made the point in your other writings, and I should mention you have got a book on the Colombo Plan coming out in June this year, published by Cambridge University Press, so we'll make sure to give that a plug when it comes out. There were many more private international students coming at this time, which I think is very little known that was a phenomenon even back then. But how much was the government using the influx of these students, international students, as a way to perhaps break down some of the prejudices that were hanging around with White Australia policy?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's hard to be really specific in answer, I think, Georgina, but there's something there. You're quite right to point to the big numbers of private students who are coming. Even by the end of the 50s, they were outnumbering Colombo Plan students by about 5 to 1 or 6 to 1 or something, the ratio.
And these were children of the wealthy Southeast Asians?
Yep.
Yeah.
But because the Colombo Plan had captured the Australian public imagination, there's a lot of publicity. It's a very good exercise in early PR, basically, cultural diplomacy. So there's a whole desk set up with the Australian News and Information Bureau devoted to Colombo Plan and Colombo Plan students.
It's amazing.
The messaging to Australians was very strong, such that those bigger numbers of private students, if you ask the average Australian how they reacted to, say, an Asian student they saw on the street, they would probably think, it must be a Colombo Plan student, even though it was unlikely to be numerically. So in that sense, I think it was very successfully attuning Australians internally to change in Asia and the capability of relationships with newly decolonising Asian countries. In terms of the White Australia policy, again, it's very hard to become too specific, but there's no doubt that the Immigration Reform League folk who really built momentum up in the early 1960s agitating for change were buoyed by some of the things they saw, courtesy of Asian students in our midst. And some of their earliest hit-outs, some of the personalities who formed the basis of the Immigration Reform League, have said that they were really turned on, switched on to their cause by thinking about the consequences of Asian students studying here and the consequences for Asian-Australian relations.
I mean, even by the end of the 1950s, you see the very sort of unfair discriminatory dictation test abolished. In 1957, it became possible for long-term Asian residents to get permanent residence and even citizenship after 15 years. Of course, that was discriminatory still because non-Asians could apply for citizenship after 5. But this was, really at a time when a lot of people would think that White Australia was still very much in force, and it wasn't entirely off the statute book. You definitely can see pathways developing for non-white Australians to become Australians.
Yes, and again, I think that's the best way to see the Colombo Plan in this mix. It, by virtue of sensitising the Australian population to the needs and the logic of Australian ties, meeting some of the needs of decolonising Asia, there was a greater Australian awareness of the possibilities that might ensue. So, electorally it was always risky, and especially in the early Menzies governments, to do too much too soon. When you look at the kind of fits and starts of policy towards Japan, you can see some pretty big reactions against changing a hard stance against Japan in the early 50s. But by 57, of course, we get that amazing commerce treaty signed. And that's around the time we're talking in terms of the impact of more students in the midst of Australians. So there's there's an environmental dimension that seems to help shift a public mood.
Yeah. Look, we've reached our 30 minutes of discussion, David, so we're now opening up to our audience Q&A. The first one, I think, is a really good question, David, that's come through. And I guess I should give some context here. So the Colombo Plan sounds like it's just this grand plan, and there was one bit of paper signed, with the UK and Australia and Canada and India and Pakistan and Ceylon, and then the US and Japan all on the sort of dotted line. But of course it wasn't that. It was a series of bilateral agreements. And I guess the Menzies government certainly took a view that it wanted the bilateral route rather than the multilateral route, like sort of UN-style route. So this question, I think, really relates to that point. What was Menzies' attitude towards the United Nations, and did this inform the Colombo Plan?
Look, probably not. You'd have to say that Menzies, as the Colombo Plan was taking shape, so let's remind ourselves that there was that conference in January 1950, another one in Sydney in May, and another one in London in September, October. These 3 conferences put together the thing we call the Colombo Plan, which, as you say, was really an invitation for a series of bilateral agreements between different countries. Now, as that's going on, I don't think Menzies is he's not overly invested in what's going to happen. He's giving Percy Spender his head very much. But Menzies, of course, being a very adept leader, is very able to see that, when there's a consensus among international opinion, especially Western opinion, that this is a jolly good thing, he comes on board. The connection to the United Nations is not terribly strong. I think Menzies, for the most part, he didn't regard international liberalism as anathema. The idea of the UN for people like Menzies and Spender was an ideal that was a terrific one to aim at. They just didn't think it was ready to land anytime soon. Such was the state of the world. So there was certainly an interest in the UN, especially when the Korean War broke out, in Menzies' case, of course. But the world didn't seem ready for that collection of ideas to really become a blueprint for action yet. Power politics, alliance politics was still going to be predominant.
It's interesting because, of course, Spender's predecessor in external affairs in the Chifley government had been Evatt, who, was a committed liberal internationalist, committed to the United Nations, played an instrumental role in the United Nations, actually, as does Spender after he leaves politics and he becomes president of the International Court of Justice, but also is, I think, president of the Security Council in Australia, is on the Security Council, not obviously as a permanent member, as one of the rotating elected members. So, Spender and Evatt as external affairs ministers had some, differing levels perhaps of commitment to the international system, but, there was a belief in it. Do you think that Menzies parted company a bit with, well, definitely with Evatt on so many things, but with Spender?
To some extent. Don't forget that, Spender's time with the UN was very much part and parcel of his time as ambassador in Washington. So he loved to run the two portfolios. Spender was a person who didn't suffer from any lack of confidence in his abilities, and he was determined to make sure that he led the Australian delegations to the UN if he was going to be in Washington as well. So he was a very strong performer in that, and he loved the lawyer's kind of capacity, which is so, useful in a UN context, to grab a debate, take it a particular way, argue forcefully, invoke precedent, and so on. That doesn't mean to say that he assumed the kind of Doc Evatt belief and faith in the capacity of the UN to usher in an order that would provide peace. I don't think he ever really shared that. He spent a lot of his time arguing to keep Indonesia out of West New Guinea. He spent a lot of time arguing about the so-called 2.7 clause of keeping people out of the domestic jurisdiction so that Australia shouldn't have to be too accountable for Papua New Guinea rule and so on. That's reasonably traditional in terms of, realist politics. But it was a forum that was becoming increasingly important. By the time we get to the mid-1950s, of course, you've got a lot more countries joining the UN. And for such an important venue, it's important to have alliances and do deals in corridors, and Spender loved that.
Yeah. And I guess Spender thought it was a way of, he believed in power politics. So it was a way of engaging the United States, because the United States at that time, it's hard to imagine it in 2025, but at that time was taking a real lead role in the United Nations.
Yes. Yeah.
Another question from our audience. Did Robert Menzies really support a diverse and inclusive Australia? And I guess there's sort of a context here from, his first foray into politics through to maybe the end of his political life.
Yeah. We began by mentioning just how bent Menzies was on development, and that, of course, included prioritising newly arrived immigrants from Europe. And we all know that, the priority was for the English-speaking world, if possible, the Anglo world, and then Northern Europeans. There was a pecking order. So when we talk about diversity, we are still, I think, for much of the Menzies era, talking about a certain pecking order in the minds of Menzies and immigration officials. But it is changing. There was no way in which in the early 1950s they could get the number of Britons they would have loved. So you adapt and you have more people coming from Southern Europe. And that's, of course, been to the great enrichment of Australia. So I think the short answer is that whilst there was probably a racial hierarchy in minds still at an official level, there was a necessary flexibility kicking in as well.
Yeah. Well, you see that in his pronouncements even in the early 40s, that Australia had to expand its population, and entertaining migrants from, he talks about Northern Europe at the beginning, would actually bring vigour and, some great benefits to Australia. And then obviously as we go on into the early 50s, you see the expansion of these migration offices around, Southern Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe, and welcoming of, something amazing like 3 million people in 10 years came to Australia in the late 40s to late 50s. Our population starts off at about 8 million and is 11 by the end. It's hard to imagine that number of people coming in sort of relative terms.
It is.
And how you could possibly have accommodated them.
Absolutely. And it does go to, if I can sort of, tie it back to the Colombo Plan interest, it was a subject of common conversation in Colombo Plan meetings. How can we develop as fast as we can, and comparing notes. The Australians never regarded themselves as developing in the way that, say, India needed development. But on the other hand, they would find themselves lining up, as did the New Zealand Prime Minister often, with some Asian leaders saying, gee, it'd be good if we had stable export prices and they weren't fluctuating so much, because then we could plan our development a bit better. So you find these countries that are bent on development in the way that Australia was, have these moments of common cause with other parts of the world, especially in the world economy where, the way in which the Americans can manipulate prices and do wheat deals might impact on not just the Australians but other parts of the world as well.
Another question we've got from our audience, it's a bit linked to the previous one but is specific to Asia, is what was Menzies' attitude towards people from Asia particularly? I mean, do you have some...
Yeah, look, that's a hard one. It's a hard one to generalise. We know that there were certain relationships that didn't go terribly well. He and Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India for this time, was not a happy relationship.
No.
They didn't get on at all.
Yeah, although that's often explained by virtue that, Nehru is a leader of the non-aligned movement, sees the world through a completely different prism to Menzies, who's an empire man, a great believer in the Commonwealth and a continuation of sort of British primacy and then US primacy. So,
yes.
Menzies was taking a side and Nehru didn't want to take a side, and Menzies could not come at that.
That's right. So it's a difficult question to answer conclusively, and you'd have to say that, there are some spectacular examples like the Nehru relationship, which didn't go well at all. I guess as something of an interesting counter to that, we might look at the visit to Australia in 1957 by Diem, the South Vietnamese Prime Minister, which is the first visit to Australia by a Prime Minister from anywhere. People tend to forget that. Without us, Diem had a fairly checkered career and he was assassinated in the early 60s. But this was a big deal and Menzies made much of it. It was about Australia's support for South Vietnam at the time. And those who've written about the history of Australia's involvement in Vietnam, of course, always mention this episode. It's a really significant thing, though. And, of course, we need to be reminding ourselves of the importance of that Japanese trade treaty that I mentioned, also in 1957. So there are things emerging which demonstrate Menzies' adeptness at adjustment to a changing world economy and changing geopolitics, even if it's a bit hard to find him warming to many Asian leaders.
It's interesting. Often critics of Menzies and critics of his attitude towards Asia will pick up on, notes from his diaries or memoirs where he hates humidity and hot climates, and he really doesn't enjoy trips to, countries of the equator, which, often are Asian countries. And so there's that sort of connection. Well, he doesn't have a very good time when he goes to Indonesia or goes to Thailand or wherever. He's in great discomfort, but that doesn't necessarily mean he didn't enjoy the company of the people or appreciate the culture or the civilizational prowess of the people. It's more that, look, he just, he was a man of a certain size and girth and I guess, didn't suit him. Doesn't suit everyone, the tropics.
And I think that's what makes Colombo Plan meetings from a historian so interesting, because they lasted. So even though it was a series of bilateral agreements, so dragging this back towards the Colombo Plan, I'm sure people will forgive me, even though it was a series of bilateral agreements, all the members would get together for about 3 or 4 weeks each year. And it's a long time to spend together, right?
And no aircon.
No aircon. And you alternated between a donor government and a recipient government. So it might be in Wellington, New Zealand, 1956, Saigon, 1957, and so on. They'd alternate. And these meetings were really important, not just for having to put up with the tropics at times, but just for getting to know other circumstances and other peoples. So I think one of the interesting things going on at the level, we've been talking about Menzies, but at that level of officials, there was an awful lot of sharing of information and people were starting to build careers in external affairs departments based on their prowess at how to administer aid, how to talk to these people over here, by virtue of how often they were bumping into each other regularly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important kind of subterranean dimension to the kind of questions we're dealing with.
There is another question from the audience here that is directly related to the Colombo Plan, David, so we can get back on track. Was the success of the Colombo Plan ever threatened by the fear of the spread of of communism? And is this fear reflected at all in the contemporary student programs? It's quite interesting bringing it into, because we haven't discussed the contemporary.
No, contemporary one's really interesting. But so let me start with the Colombo Plan specific one. I think what was remarkable about the Colombo Plan was that it navigated the Cold War. I can't say that there weren't at times Cold War lenses brought to bear. So, for example, the Vietnamese army, I've been talking about Vietnam a bit in the early 1960s or late 50s, was given Colombo Plan money to have radios that would enable the army to work better. Clearly, there's a Cold War dimension to that. So every now and then the Cold War would intrude on decisions, no doubt about it. But what's interesting is how the Colombo Plan sort of sailed throughout the Cold War and enjoyed its own kind of reputation relatively undiminished in spite of this. So, for example, the classic one is in Konfrontasi, confrontation with Indonesia in, the mid-1960s. Australian-Indonesian relations, terrible, absolutely awful for a short time as Sukarno ramps up confrontation. What was interesting was at the same time, through back channels and subtle diplomacy, the leaders of both countries said, well, let's not let this endanger Colombo Plan funding at all. We still want our students to come to Australia. We still want that to be an avenue of discourse. So what Gareth Evans in the 1990s started to call the ballast of diplomacy, where you banked goodwill in various ways, was very much happening through the Colombo Plan. And it enabled you to ride through crises of, likes of confrontation and other Cold War inflected dynamics. So I think it's a good dimension to the Colombo Plan. Moving to more recent times.
Yeah, and I guess just explain for the benefit of those who aren't aware of the new Colombo Plan, what that is too and when it came about.
Yeah, so New Colombo Plan, of course, launched in 2014 under Julie Bishop. Great new initiative to sort of reverse the flow, to get Australian students going to parts of the region for an intensive experience that would sensitise them to the region, get a glimpse of how Australia's economic future was more enmeshed in our region, and hopefully sow some seeds so that when they came home, they would want to go back, build networks and so on. And you have to say that by and large, it's been reasonably successful in terms of cultivating this new generation of younger Australians. It's
very popular. I mean,
yeah, it has its critics.
Prestigious too.
But it's still quite prestigious, and most universities have really jumped on board. Does the politics of geopolitics enter into New Colombo Plan decision-making? I think not much would be my short answer. The higher education sector, which is a huge topic of conversation about how dependent it became on international students to prop up diminishing sources of revenue and how that's created a particular dependence on Chinese students for a time, that clearly is not devoid of geopolitical considerations, and that's clearly sensitive to concerns. We've heard many concerns about the way in which the Communist Chinese Party has perhaps at times tried to work its way into Australian public life. That's well documented. To some extent, that's been discussed in relation to the student body. But I guess what I would say is that by and large, given the numbers of students that have come to Australia in more recent times, what's been more remarkable is how devoid of kind of political consequences the student body has been. And that's, given the numbers, the sheer numbers, that's been pretty remarkable. So that's not to say, things might not change and there might be some sensitivities in the current climate. But the story of international students coming to Australia from early days, from the kind of 50s that I was talking about to more recent times, has generally been a pretty positive one, I think, from both the students' point of view, I hope, and from the point of view of Australians, not just in economic raw terms of the economic value, but in terms of enrichment, awareness, building networks, enhancing worldview, boosting the ways in which capital cities function and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I always tell the anecdote, and I know I've told you this before, that one of my very good friends who was posted to the Australian High Commission in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, in the 2010s, he said at that time, every single member of the Malaysian cabinet had been to university in Australia. And some were Colombo Plan, some may have been private students, of course, and given the elite connections there, probably the latter, but still that kind of soft power, relationship building impact that international education opportunities in Australia have with their home country is incredible.
It's a really good point. And I think Malaysia is one of those countries that stands out. They really have a really strong Colombo Plan alumni group. And as you were recalling, Georgina, the High Commission's always been quite sensitive to that. They look after their alumni, Colombo Plan alumni. Indonesia too, you can find clusters of people in Indonesia who enjoyed their experiences in Australia, and they looked out for other people to rise through the ranks of the Indonesian public service who'd been to Australia. So when I interviewed Vice President Budiono, because he's a former Colombo Plan scholar, in order to get access to interview him, the layers I went through just happened to have all been Australians, educated people as well. It was quite interesting to note that.
Yeah. I mean, that's amazing. As a diplomat, and I'm a former diplomat myself, that's an amazing gift to your diplomatic network in the country. There's a couple of really interesting questions. We're sort of going back to Menzies, how he was viewed. So in terms of Menzies' stature and reputation at the United Nations and I guess internationally, how was he viewed, do you think? Do you get and particularly, I guess, from Colombo Plan recipient countries, there's, a suggestion here that he might have been seen as arrogant and racist. I mean, is that how you've read the archives?
Menzies was pretty good at letting the Colombo Plan run a course which didn't involve him too much, which was probably the right thing to do. You'd have to say at the United Nations level, again, he was similar. So, we talked about Percy Spender turning up, but also Casey and others turned up at the biggest moments. Menzies' own moments at the UN weren't terribly glorious in the early 60s. He was sort of set up to fail when he tried to suggest a big powwow between the Russians and Americans, and everyone voted that down in humiliating circumstances.
Oh, well, was he ill-advised by his diplomats? Or
Yes, but he also thought that the world was still perhaps capable of a little bit like the World War II summatory, where if only, the big 3 or 4 could get in the room together, you could resolve things. By the time we got to the early 60s, there were a number of United Nations members pretty keen to say that wasn't the way things worked. So he sort of set himself up, and the Brits and Americans let him fail a bit too. It wasn't a glorious episode. So his relationship with the UN in the latter part of his tenure as Prime Minister probably wasn't great, you'd have to say. Similarly, within the Commonwealth, there was that crucial moment as South Africa was leaving on, racially discriminatory grounds. They left before they were kicked out. And at a crucial meeting, Harold Macmillan left the chair and handed it to the longest-serving Prime Minister was Nehru rather than Menzies, just.
I see.
And Menzies was mortally wounded by that. So there were some institutions like the Commonwealth and UN which he felt were letting him down by the time we get to that early 60s period, which is part of the answer, I think, to that question.
Yeah. Well, they're very interesting insights, David. A question here, which I'm very curious to know the answer to, actually. What did Evatt say or feel about the Colombo Plan? Do you have...
look, he was mostly positive. He liked to say that we had, set things in train, which I guess is what you'd expect him to say. And to some extent they had. There was a very successful mission, well, partly successful, I should say, mission by McMahon Ball in 1948, going around the countries of newly decolonising.
We should explain who McMahon Ball is. And we are here at a university that has the McMahon Ball Lecture Theatre. So a very important figure for Melbourne Uni.
Absolutely. Very important. Public intellectual, external affairs, kind of luminary. And he was commissioned by the Australian government under the Chifley government to undertake a so-called goodwill tour of South and Southeast Asia. And he came back with the idea of scholarships, right? We should be providing scholarships. Now, it was only partly successful. He still encountered a fair bit of resentment at White Australia in 1948. But that, plus some of the other work that I mentioned going on in external affairs under John Burton and others of Evatt's time, did form a really important backdrop to the ideas that were bundled up by Spender in Colombo. So by and large, we find Evatt being broadly supportive of the Colombo Plan and mostly sharpening attacks on the kind of more Cold War lines that Spender and Casey and others were drawing.
Yeah. An interesting question here. In 100 years' time, so I guess in 2150, what will people say about the Colombo Plan? I mean, we're talking here now 75 years on since the sort of first conceptualisation of the plan. But
so it depends a bit where you are. So we're here in Australia, and my argument is that the Australians have, partly with good reason, they've sort of appropriated the Colombo Plan in the same way that we can do things like Gallipoli. We've sort of owned it in ways that are a little bit unfair to other countries. Understandable, because we're very proud of that legacy of students coming and how it changed our thinking. If you're not an Australian, though, and so that'll probably continue, it'll be part of the story of how Australia came to be more constructive in its relationships with Asia, I think. But if you're not in Australia. I would argue that the Colombo Plan, partly by virtue of those long meetings that I mentioned, actually paved the way for a new kind of laboratory of diplomacy, which was really important when people, between, say, Canada and America and places like India and Burma and Thailand and Australia, they didn't get together on a regular basis very often beforehand. These annual meetings were really important to get to know each other, to not have grand pronouncements, to cultivate what these days we'd call networking, and to form a kind of consensus-based diplomacy where you didn't rock too many boats, but you paved the way for a sort of what might be called the ASEAN way of, not too much dissent, talking in terms of lots of common agreement in ways that forged an experimental new form of diplomacy.
Yeah. One thing we didn't get onto that someone's reminded me about is the role of Japan. Sorry, we're backtracking a bit now in the Colombo Plan. It joins a bit later.
Joins in 54. And the Colombo Plan was very important to Japan, maybe in a way that's a little bit akin to Australia, because it was the means by which Japan basically re-emerged after the war in Asia. It was the gateway that was opened. So Japan didn't join the UN until just after it joined the Colombo Plan, right, as a sovereign power. So it was the pathway back into constructive relationships from a very low ebb, of course, with countries in South and Southeast Asia. And that slowly built up momentum such that by the mid-60s, a decade on after joining, Japan could play a lead role in the Asia Development Bank. So you can see Colombo Plan being a really important stepping stone for Japan's re-emergence in international society and in regional ways of thinking and behaving.
And I guess another question related to that is, Japan has invaded quite a lot of Southeast Asia, obviously attacked Australia, but, there were Southeast Asian countries that had been taken over by Japan and had very direct experiences of some of the brutality of World War II and Japanese imperial armies. So, how did Japan go about, through things like the Colombo Plan, assuaging fears and rebuilding friendships and relationships?
Yeah, look, it was fits and starts. There was no magic kind of bullet that would solve the legacy of so much hurt and so much destruction and killing. The Colombo Plan, I would suggest, is a really important step. The other one is those reparations agreements, which were finally worked out with many countries in the latter part of the 1950s. So they finally come up with some sums on reparations. And we find Japan, by the time we get to the end of the decade, by around 1960, Japan is trying to lead the way in coming up with new aid initiatives. So you can see this kind of really deliberate attempt to build bridges. It's slow, it's staggering, and it's not without memories popping up, but it's a really concerted diplomatic path that they're on.
So 2 minutes left here. Thank you to our audience for all these questions. It's fantastic. So we're going to be a bit lightning round here, David. Did the Colombo Plan cost Australia a lot of money? For example, what percentage of GDP would it have cost?
Oh, good question. Look, very small. I'm not sure we're talking, less than 1% for most of the time that it was really in its heyday from the 1950s and 60s. So very small. And you'd have to say that many people have argued great bang for buck. So the technical assistance part of it, the sponsoring of students, wasn't really expensive at all. And yet the good publicity generated was huge.
Yeah, great. Very efficiently answered. What about this one? Which countries provided the most students, roughly in what order? So I guess this is to Australia.
Yeah, so mostly from South Asia for reasons that were partly Commonwealth historic reasons, but also those who were most prepared to come. So mostly, if we're still talking about that key period of 50s and 60s, they're mostly coming from South Asia, India, Pakistan, and then progressively Malaysia and Indonesia to become increasingly important. But that's the order for most of the time.
Well, David Lowe, thank you so much for joining me on this special episode of Afternoon Light Live. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.